We would like to get your opinion on how 2010 is going to impact small to medium-sized businesses, in particular with inflation, interest rates, employment, the gross domestic product, new business developments, and bankruptcy.
Okay, well, I will first of all say that I'm not a fortune teller, I'm not a magician, I can't tell the future. I can tell you that as of now, we're now sitting here in my study in middle of January 2010. It looks as if we're in a fairly strong recovery. The GDP numbers for the United States for the last quarter are quite strong. It has so far been a very painful recovery for the ordinary citizen because jobs are not coming back. In fact, the jobless rate is stagnant, and the number of people jobless is not improving at all. The number of people looking for jobs and unable to find them is cruelly large. Usually this is true of a recovery, and a recovery from a recession as severe as this will take a long time. Now, let's stop and put a pin in that and say, people always say to me, what would you do if you were Mr. Obama and you were asked to do whatever you could as fast as you could to bring about a recovery? And I think what I would do is go on vacation for a year and take Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid with me, because they have injected so much uncertainty into the business process in this country that it is very difficult for people to hire. Even if you think there's going to be a recovery in your business, do you want to hire someone knowing that there may be a substantial liability for that person's health care costs? Do you want to hire somebody knowing there may be a substantial liability for environmental costs, cap and trade costs, carbon tax costs, any kind of emissions costs? Do you want to hire that person knowing that President Obama has already said that he's in favor of higher taxes on well-to-do people, so your taxes may go up? There's too much darn uncertainty. Usually to get a recovery, what you need is the Federal Reserve churning out money. That they're doing very, very well. But you also need some predictability and stability. We're not getting that from President Obama. We're getting a tremendous flow of uncertainty, and that is very bad for hiring and for the recovery.
Are you concerned with all the churning out of money that it may have some negative impact on inflation?
Well, typically economic theory would predict that the quantity of money upon rising as fast as this one has would generate inflation. But inflation is generated by money plus the velocity of money, the rate at which money turns over, so to speak. And that has a lot to do with consumer confidence. And we're in a situation of extremely poor consumer confidence and extremely poor lender and investor confidence. So that is inhibiting the velocity of money. The volume growing very fast, velocity either not growing or shrinking. I'll give you, if I may, an example. We all are self-referential, so I'll give you a self-referential example. A few months ago, I bought a condo in North Idaho, a beautiful, beautiful area, North Idaho, Lake Pend Oreille. It's unbelievably, just astoundingly beautiful. The people who made that loan to me, made the loan to that for me, came back to me just a few days ago and said, well, we've cut our interest rate, and we could make you a loan. I have another condo there on that loan at a lower interest rate. I said, well, if you can do that, go ahead and do it. I'd rather have a lower interest rate. Then they called me back today and said, our lender is only lending 50% on the value of condos in this very, very beautiful part of Idaho. Well, that is a perfect example of what's gone wrong in this country. The volume is just churning out there, and that has lowered the interest rate, but the willingness to lend is very, very poor, and a situation in which a lender will only lend 50% is a situation of extreme fear. And that's what we're in right now.
Do you have any fears of raising interest rate to try and counter the inflation having negative impact?
I think Mr. Bernanke is savvy enough to know not to do that. You know, Mr. Bernanke's great skill, supposedly, is in understanding the causes of the Great Depression, one of which was tightening money way too fast in the early stages when it looked like the recovery was going to be a brief recovery. They started turning the monetary screws. That caused a really terribly sharp downturn from 1930 to 31. Then again in 1937, when it looked like we were having a recovery, and we're having actually inflation, they turned the monetary brakes on, or stepped on the monetary brakes very hard, and that caused a really, really bad recession within a depression. I believe that I hope and pray Mr. Bernanke will not do that again. Now, there are plenty of voices telling him to do that, but those voices, I think, have not read the history. The voices belong to brains that have not read the history of the Great Depression. It would be, I think, folly for him to start raising interest rates at this stage.
What do you think the positives are that we can look forward to in 2010, especially for small businesses?
Well, the recovery will get moving. It looks like it's already starting to get moving in the automobile industry, which is a very, very important part of total American industry. The real question is, will the recovery get moving in the shelter area, in residential and a shelter for sale or for rent? That's where there's just been a terrible drag on the economy. I don't see any sign of recovery there at all. Home builder share prices have gone up a lot, but as for signs of recovery, I don't see much of it. I had dinner, let's see, we're in the middle of January. I had dinner in the middle of December with Warren Buffett, and he has very large interest in home building, carpet making, brick making, furniture, jewelry. He said he's not seeing recovery at all in those areas, and if he doesn't see it, I don't see it either, and I don't think anyone else sees it. Eventually it will happen. Now, there is no such thing as a housing bust from which there's not a recovery. At least there hasn't been one ever yet. But it can take years. Look, we hit our peak probably roughly spring of 2005, the very, very peak. After that, stayed on a plateau for a while, then it started to crash down in 2007. Will we see prices like they were in 2005 and volume like there was in 2005? Yes, but it could easily be not till 2015. Easily. That would be not even a little bit surprising.
Do you see any changes for 2011 from 2010?
Well, there will be continued recovery unless something unexpected comes along to stop it. I mean, once a recovery starts, it usually doesn't stop. I mean, there could be serious monetary policy mistakes that would stop it, but absent monetary policy mistakes, I don't think there's likely to be a double-dip recession. I mean, we've already had the longest recession of the post-war period. We've had a very severe recession, although not really as severe as the one at the beginning of the 80s. It would take serious monetary policy and fiscal policy mistakes to put us back into a downward movement. They could happen, though. I mean, I'm very worried about fiscal policy. I'm very worried about Mr. Obama trying to raise taxes too much, and especially on business owners. I mean, small business owners are extremely susceptible to the level of taxation.
Well, what do you think the greatest economic hazards are out there for the next 5 years?
For the next 5 years, one, mistakes in monetary policy in which they tighten too fast. Two, mistakes in monetary policy in which they don't tighten fast enough. As we could go from a state of sort of a sluggish recovery to a very rapid recovery to a very fast rise in inflation. I don't see it happening. It hasn't happened anywhere else in the Western world, and I don't see it happening here. We have the example of Japan. Now, Japan is so far the world's second largest economy. At some point fairly soon, I guess China will overtake it. But Japan has proved a kind of a challenge to economic theory, because economic theory would say if you are running large deficits, creating huge amounts of total national debt, if you are generating huge increases in the money supply, you will get inflation. But they've done all three of those things and have no inflation at all. So just exactly why that is, we don't know. And why we would differ from that, I don't know. Look, there's been a huge amount of money surge in Western Europe and in China and in Japan, and there's so far not much inflation. There's some commodity inflation, but in terms of finished goods prices and finished services prices, there's not much inflation. There's, I think, just too much slackness in consumer demand for there to be inflation anytime soon. At some point, if the Fed just keeps printing money, there has to be inflation, at least so we think, but I don't see it coming. I don't see it coming anytime soon. It could be totally wrong. All people should be hedged against inflation. That's Treasury inflation-protected securities from the U.S. Treasury. That's real estate. That would be some commodities. There's already been commodities inflation, but if there's inflation, there'll be more. I don't recommend gold. Gold is way too risky and fluctuates way too much, pays no interest or dividends. But the watchword is prudence, and I'm afraid with the watchword being prudence, people don't get hired.